Hi, my name is Sandra Obradović. I am a lecturer at the Open University, and in this talk I'll be discussing the psychological and relational appeal of populism, and particularly focusing on three domains of psychological theorizing and research that I think is useful for understanding why populism has appeal among voters. So focusing more on the demand side of populism in this talk. So the first thing really to note is that the psychology of intergroup relations is at the core of populism. We see this in terms of the general definition of populism as the sort of framing of us versus them, and we see it throughout research on sort of the mobilizers and drivers of populism tending to be framed around collective or group concerns rather than individual concerns. So in psychology, decades of research has shown that humans do have a tendency to form identities in relation to groups and to construe the social world in terms of in-groups and out-groups. Indeed, we see this in classical definitions of populism, where populism constructs society as divided between us, the pure people, and them, the corrupt and self-serving elites. We also see this and we see this in both left and right-wing populism. We also see this in frameworks of populism that emphasize opposition, such as the work by Brubaker, which argues that it's not only one in-group and one out-group, but rather in-groups and out-groups are defined in both horizontal and vertical ways. So whereas the vertical axes would position the in-group as the people and the out-group as political elites, for example, horizontal opposition or the horizontal axis tends to position the sort of ethnic in-groups against the socio-cultural, ethnically different others. Now, the usefulness of this kind of framework is that it allows us to understand how populist appeal cuts across socioeconomic lines by being able to unite groups of diverse socioeconomic backgrounds as part of one moral majority. We also see the coupling of the vertical and horizontal outgroups for example, in right-wing populism, where ethnic minority groups such as Muslims in Western societies are seen as being favored by cultural and political elites at the expense of ethnic majorities. So what both of these definitions really allow us to understand is that expressions of populism are context sensitive, and that the meaning of the people will differ across contexts. But some elements tend to be common. Notably, we tend to have expressions of shared grievances that sort of unite the in-group, and we also tend to have a scapegoating, where the scapegoating is focused on the vertical and the horizontal opposition. We also tend to see a presence of anti-establishment sentiments, especially with understanding how the emphasis on sovereignty and popular sovereignty is important for populist politics and how politics should be understood. But it also means that because the meaning of the people differs across contexts, the ways in which we frame intergroup relations and the accompanying hierarchies in society will be different as well. So in context of right-wing populism, we tend to see intergroup relations be framed along cultural and ethnic lines. In context of left-wing populism, however, the framing of group relations tend to be along economic and political lines more so often. But what's also important is that what's crucial for the success of a populist party is not only the ability to construct a sort of common identity and to categorize the world in a way that this group cuts across social cleavages, but it is also the ability to position a leader as a sort of prototype of this in-group. So populist leaders are successful to the extent that they not only position them as part of a group, but as the voice of that group, as the prototype, both through how they act, how they speak, and how they sort of perform their identities. Now, this notion of identity entrepreneurship allows us to better understand the conflicting findings around the links between economic conditions and the rise of populism. For example, we see that populist leaders are supported both by high and low income earners, but also that they find support both in times of economic decline and prosperity. So why would that necessarily be the case if it's about coming together around a populist leader in times of crisis? Well, it's not because populist leaders emerge in times of crisis, but it's because they're also successful at constructing society as being in crisis. So just as economic hardship can easily be blamed on perceived outgroups, objective economic prosperity can be perceived as problematic when this prosperity is constructed as benefiting only a small group of society from which most voters are excluded. And this kind of construal would gain traction if it's advanced by a leader who is seen and who speaks as embodying the wider in-group that is marginalized by elites. Now, this idea that populist leaders as entrepreneurs of identity are able to construct in-groups as under threat leads us to the second point, which is the importance of understanding how the psychology of status and hierarchy shapes responses to socioeconomic change. So this distinction between us and them intersects with notions of hierarchy. It's not just about us having a lot as a group or us having a little, but it's relative. It's about having more or less than other groups. So the subjective construal of access to resources is then viewed through the lens of an intergroup hierarchy. One way in which status concerns tend to manifest themselves is in reactions towards a perceived lowering or potential lowering in one's position in a societal hierarchy. So drops in hierarchy position are experienced as threatening, and groups become one avenue through which a sense of control and power can be restored. Now, we find support for this in research on relative deprivation, showing that it continues to be a key trigger for support for right-wing populism, more specifically. This focus on status and this focus on hierarchy, coupled with intergroup relations, allows us to move beyond the divide between economic and cultural drivers of populism, and instead to see how the former operates through the latter. So how economic concerns and potential threats to economic prosperity are framed through an intergroup hierarchy that in a right-wing populism context is defined by groups along cultural ethnic lines. So it's not just about the objective, but it's more importantly about the relative, especially the relative deprivation of a group in comparison to another group. Now, concerns about status and this perceived threat to resources, but also the identification of a scapegoat and someone to blame for grievances. This all highlights that populist communication is fraught with references to and really does mobilize collective emotions. So this is a sort of third point that we really want to emphasize. Now, emotional drivers, emotion has been found continuously to be a driver of voter support for populist parties. This includes feelings of collective resentment, of anger, of a sense of threat, but also fear. So we see that sort of these negative emotions have already been found to drive a lot of support for populist parties. But it's not only about negative emotions. It's not only about constructing society as facing a crisis. It's also about being able to construct one's party and the politics that they are pursuing as offering an optimistic alternative. So collective hope is something that has been seen to be offered by a lot of populist leaders in their discourse and in their politics, but also, and perhaps more importantly, is the affirmation of a positive in-group identity in context where groups feel that they're being marginalized or stigmatized on behalf of ethnic minorities or on behalf of more powerful elites or cultural groups. The ability of a leader to affirm a positive in-group identity can be quite meaningful and quite mobilizing for voters. So we see that positive affect, for example, tends to be more common within populist discourse, and this emotional appeal, again, is also framed in relational terms. It's about offering hope for our group and improving our conditions. So not only about me as an individual, but me as a part of a particular group that is seen to be suffering or losing out. Seen through this lens, populist support is driven by a parochial desire to help one's group when it's perceived to be under threat, and research on internal political efficacy shows that actually a lot of voters maybe perceive themselves as being more able to support the group and to make decisions on behalf of the group than they consider political leaders. So these 3 points that we've offered today, these 3 points that we've offered today are really been focused on exploring populism and its psychological and relational logic. And with this, we show that the divisions between us and them really tap into core intergroup dynamics. These intergroup dynamics, in turn, are situated within a societal hierarchy where economic and cultural processes are construed in terms of basic status concerns that are affecting groups, not only individuals, but individuals as part of groups. Now, these hierarchies are framed in different ways depending on what the host ideology of a society is, but nevertheless, the hierarchy is still there, and there's this sort of tug of war between groups, both along vertical and horizontal axes. And lastly, this emphasis on perceived loss within society and loss as being part of a particular group becomes mobilized through the use of affective-laden political rhetoric that is common for populist leaders. But it's important to note that this rhetoric isn't just utilizing and sort of capitalizing on negative sentiments and negative emotions, but it's also offering positive alternatives. It's also drawing on positive emotions such as hope and joy and pride in one's in-group and the identity that they hold. So I hope you've enjoyed this quick review of the psychological and relational appeal of populism, and thank you for listening to this talk.